the summer of the year of our Lord 783, a longship left the harbor of Kirkwall in Orkney on the 9th day after the feast of St. John. It carried 32 Norse warriors under a captain called Grímr Ironshank, and one slave, an Irish monk taken from a monastery on the island of Iona 2 winters earlier. The ship sailed west by northwest into open water for 11 days. The purpose of the voyage was set down in the ship's roll as land-taking. That was the word they used, land-taking. 6 of those 32 warriors rowed east again, 22 days later, along a coastline they could not name. The slave rowed with them. He was the only man aboard who could still read what he saw. 6 out of 32. And the slave. I have kept the account of what happened in the days between the landing and the return. I have kept it in my own hand, in Latin, in a psalter small enough to hide beneath a cloak, because there is no man in this world, no jarl, no priest, no bishop who would permit it to be spoken aloud. I have kept it for 61 years. I am keeping it still, though my hand shakes and the ink runs thin, because I do not think I have another winter in me, and there is a thing on that island that must be written down before I die. I will tell you what happened on the island. I will tell you what we found on the shore. I will tell you what walked out of the fire on the 7th night, and what it did to Grímr Ironshank, and what it did not do to me. But I will not tell you yet. Not what it was, not why it let me live. Those are not the first things. The first thing is the arithmetic. 32 men and a slave. 6 men and a slave. That is the whole ledger. That is the shape of what I'm about to say. Everything else, the ash on the water, the chain in the sand, the old stone the axes could not break, the breathing in the trees for 3 nights before we saw it. Everything else is only the working out of that subtraction. My name is Fintan Mac Édain. I am an Irish monk, 68 years of age, brother of the house of Lindisfarne in the kingdom of Northumbria. I am the slave who rowed east. I am the last of the 7 who came back. I was 27 years old in the summer of 783, and I had been a slave for 22 months. The men who took me were not the men who sailed the longship west. The men who took me were dead, 3 of them, of a fever they contracted in the Hebrides that autumn. One of them of a wound he had earned in the raid on Iona itself. Taken by a brother of mine whose name I will not write here because it does me no good to remember it. My ownership had passed by inheritance, and then by gift, and then by sale. And by the time the ship left Kirkwall, I belonged to a man I had known for 11 days. His name was Grímr, called Ironshank because of a wound below his left knee that had healed with a piece of a spearhead still inside the bone, so that when he walked on wet weather, he limped, and when he walked in dry weather, he did not. He was 44 years old that summer. He had commanded 3 voyages before this one, 2 into the Baltic, 1 along the western coast of Alba, and he was known in Orkney as a captain who did not lose men. That reputation was true when the ship left Kirkwall. It ceased to be true on the 7th day after we landed. I was aboard because I could read Latin, and because I could read runes, and because Grímr had been told by the jarl who sold me that I could read the marks on old stones. The jarl had told him this to raise my price. I had never read the marks on an old stone in my life. I had read the Psalms of David, and I had read Cassiodorus, and I had read the life of St. Columba in the hand of the abbot who taught me, and I had read the names of my brothers on the pillar in the refectory at Iona because I had helped to carve them. I had not read runes. I did not tell Grímr this. A slave does not correct the man who is paid for him. The ship's roll was kept by the second in command, a man named Asbjorn, who was called Barefist for reasons that had nothing to do with bears. He wrote in a hand I could not read, which was Norse runes cut with a knife into a strip of birch, but he read the names aloud on the morning of the departure, so that the men would know they had been counted. And I counted with him. 32. I counted a 33rd mark on the birch, a small crosshatch below Grímr's name, and I asked, in the poor Norse I had by then, what it was. Asbjorn told me it was the mark of the slave. It was not a name. It was the mark of the slave. I understood then that I had been counted, but that I had not been named. And I understood also that if I did not return, the mark would be erased with a thumbnail, and the ship would be said to have left with 32. We sailed on the 9th day after the feast of St. John. The wind was out of the southeast. Grímr was not a superstitious man in the ordinary sense, but he was a man who paid attention to the direction of the wind at departure, and a southeasterly wind on St. John's octave was, by his reckoning, favorable. He said so aloud to the crew as the sail was raised, and the crew agreed with him. And I remember thinking that they would have agreed with him about anything he said in that hour, because they wanted to leave. The men who sail west from Orkney in summer want to leave. They do not want to be persuaded. They want to be permitted. I was seated at the midship oar bench on the starboard side, between two men called Eyvindr and Thorolfr. Eyvindr was 17. Thorolfr was 39 and had been at sea for 20 of those years, and he did not speak to me for the first 4 days. Eyvindr did. Eyvindr asked me, on the 2nd day, what the small book was that I kept beneath my cloak. I told him it was a book of psalms. He asked what a psalm was. I told him it was a song sung to God. He asked which God. I told him. He nodded and said he had heard of that God, and that his mother had known a woman in Rogaland who prayed to that God, and that the woman had died of a wasting sickness in the 2nd year of Eyvindr's life. He did not say this cruelly. He said it as a boy says a fact he has been told, and is repeating to see whether it is still true. I did not read from the Psalter aloud on the ship. Grímr had heard me speak Latin once in Kirkwall, when I had been asked by another slave to say a prayer over a child, and he had told me, in front of his men, that Latin was priest noise, and that priest noise was not to be made on his ship, and that if I made it, he would put me over the side. I did not doubt him. I did not make it. I read the Psalter silently beneath my cloak, with my hand on the page and my lips closed, and I wrote in it in the same way, with a stylus I had made from a gull's leg bone that I had sharpened against the ship's ballast stone on the 2nd night. I wrote in the margin beside the 14th psalm, on the 2nd night of the voyage, Navis disesset, ego eneasum, Deus mecum est, aut non est. The ship has departed. I am in it. God is with me, or he is not. I did not know when I wrote that it was the first entry of the account. I thought it was a private complaint. It became, over the 61 years that followed, the first sentence of the only record of the voyage that survives. We sailed for 11 days. I will not tell you what happened on each of those days, because most of them were nothing. The wind held. The sea was calm. The men rowed when the wind failed and rested when it did not. Grímr took a bearing at midday by the sun and at midnight by the pole star. And he kept the ship on a heading he called the Finger of the West, which was neither due west nor west, by north, but something between them, a heading he claimed to have learned from a Frisian pilot in his youth. I do not know if the Frisian pilot was real. I know only that on the 10th day, at midday, Grímr said to Asbjorn that we would sight land before dark on the 11th day. We sighted land at the 3rd hour of the afternoon of the 11th day. Grímr was right. It is the last thing he was right about that I can name without hesitation. On the morning of the 9th day of the voyage, 2 days before we sighted land, there was ash on the water. I noticed it first. This is not a boast. I was seated at the starboard oar, and the ash was on the starboard side, and I looked down at the water because I had been looking down at the water for 9 days, and there was nothing else to look at. The ash was in a thin band, no wider than a man's forearm, running parallel to the ship's course. It was gray. It was not floating on the surface in the way that wood ash floats. It was suspended just below the surface, in a layer perhaps a finger deep, and it moved with the water the way silt moves in a river mouth. I reached down and took some of it between my fingers. It was cold. It was fine. It had no smell that I could name at first, but when I put my hand to my face to look at it more closely, I recognized the smell. And the smell was hair. Burnt hair. Not wood, not tar, not any of the things a burning ship burns. Hair, I told Eyvind. Eyvind told Thorolfur. Thorolfur told Asbjorn. Asbjorn told Grímr. By the time Grímr came to the starboard side to look at the ash, the band had widened to the breadth of the ship, and the ship was passing through it. And Grímr said, without kneeling to look at it, "A burning ship, somewhere to the north. Some fool struck a rock in a fog. It is nothing." I said, in Norse, "Captain, the smell is not wood." Grímr said, "You are a monk. You do not know the smell of a burning ship." I said, "I know the smell of burnt hair." Grímr looked at me then, for the first time on the voyage, as if I were a man and not a piece of cargo. He looked at me for the space of one breath. Then he looked at the ash again. And then he looked back at me, and he said, "A burning ship carried sheep. The sheep burned with the ship. It is nothing. Return to your oar." I returned to my oar. I did not argue. But I noted, in the margin of the 22nd Psalm, on the 9th night of the voyage, in the small Latin I had by then made habitual, "Sines in aqua non ligni sed pili, capitaneus dicit nihil est, ego dico non nihil." Ash in the water, not of wood, but of hair. The captain says it is nothing. I say it is not nothing. The ash was with us for the whole of the 9th day and into the 10th. It thinned in the afternoon of the 10th day and was gone by nightfall. When Grímr took his bearing at midnight from the pole star, he told Asbjorn that we had sailed through it and were past it. And Asbjorn told the men. And the men were relieved, because a band of ash on open water disturbs sailors, even when the captain calls it nothing. I was disturbed for a different reason. I had been looking at the ash for 2 days, and I had come to notice that it was not moving with the current. The current at that latitude, in that season, ran from the southwest to the northeast. The ash was drifting from the northwest. It was coming from where we were going. And when Grímr said, at midnight, that we had passed through it, what he meant was that the source of the ash was behind us in one direction and ahead of us in the other, and we had chosen the direction ahead. I did not tell him this. He would not have listened, and I was not certain then that the ash was significant. I thought it was a curiosity. I thought it was one of the many small, strange things that a monk from Iona sees at sea and remembers. I understood the significance of it on the 7th day after landfall, when I stood on the black sand of the shore and put my tongue to the wind, and tasted the same taste that had been on my fingers in the middle of the ocean 2 weeks before. But I did not know that yet. On the 9th night of the crossing, I only wrote, "Non nihil," not nothing. Eyvind, who had watched me write, asked me what the words meant. I told him. He asked me why I had written them. I said, because the captain was wrong about the ash, and I did not want to be the only man on the ship who knew it. Eyvind said, "Then you should tell the men." I said, "A slave does not tell the men." Eyvind said, "I will tell them." I said, "You will not. They will not believe you either, and you will lose the respect you have from Thorolfur, and you will need Thorolfur before this voyage is over." Eyvind was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How do you know I will need Thorolfur?" I said, "I do not. I only know that a boy of 17 on his first voyage needs a man of 39 who has been to sea for 20 years. He nodded. He did not tell the men. Thorolfur did not know, until the morning we sighted land, that his oar partner had been carrying the first warning of the voyage in a language none of them could read. We sighted land on the 11th day, in the 3rd hour of the afternoon. It was a mountain first. a black cone rising from the sea, capped with cloud that was not cloud. Grímr, standing at the prow, took one look and said aloud that we had found a new coast. The men cheered. Asbjorn began to work out the anchorage. Eyvindur looked at me, and I looked back at him, and neither of us cheered. The cloud at the top of the mountain was smoke. I had seen enough hearth smoke in my life to know smoke from cloud. The mountain was burning, and the ash that had been on the water for 2 days had been the ash of the mountain. And the mountain was where we were going. And Grímr Ironshank had not looked at it long enough to know. That was the first of the anomalies. That is rung 1 of the ladder I have been climbing in my head for 61 years, though I did not know then what a ladder was, or that I was on it. I only knew that on the 11th day at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, in the summer of 783, I saw the smoke on the top of the Black Mountain, and I understood that we were not going to a new coast. We were going to something that was already on fire before we arrived. The ship struck the beach at the 6th hour of the afternoon of the 11th day, in a small bay on the southeastern side of the island, sheltered from the wind by a headland of black basalt that rose perhaps 40 ells above the water. The beach was black sand. I had never seen black sand before. I had heard from a monk at Iona who had traveled to the south that there were beaches of black sand on the shores of certain islands in the sea below Sicily. And I had not believed him. I believed him then. The sand was fine, and it was cold, and when the keel of the longship ground into it, the sand made a sound I had not heard sand make before. A sound like the sound a smith's slag makes when it is raked from a cooling forge. The men were off the ship in the space of 2 breaths. Grímr was the 3rd off. I was the last off because I was the slave, and because I was carrying the water cask that had been my responsibility on the crossing. I set the cask on the sand, and I looked up, and I noticed, in the same instant, 3 things. The first thing was that there were no birds. An island of that size, in that sea, at that season, should have been thick with fulmars and gannets and puffins, and the cliffs behind the beach should have been white with their droppings, and the air should have been loud with their calling. There were no birds. There were no droppings on the cliffs. The air was silent in a way that ocean air is never silent. The second thing was that the water in the bay was warm. I had put my hand into it as I stepped from the ship, expecting the cold I'd put my hand into for 11 days. And the water was warm, not hot, warm. The temperature of blood cooled by an hour of standing. The third thing was the smell. It was faint, but it was there. And it was the same smell I had put my hand to on the 9th day of the crossing, burnt hair, on the beach, in the air. I noted these 3 things silently. I did not speak them. Grímr was walking up the beach with Asbjorn, calling for a party to scout the tree line, and I was not in the party, and the men who were in the party were laughing, because they had reached land, and land is what a Norseman on a longship wants above all things. I stayed with the water cask. Eyvindur stayed with me. Eyvindur had noticed the silence. I saw him tilt his head to it, but he did not name it, and I did not name it to him, because it was not yet the time to name it. Rung 1 had already been dismissed by the captain on the 9th day of the crossing. Rung 2 was about to arrive, and it would need to arrive from a source Grímr could not dismiss as easily as he had dismissed the ash. The source of Rung 2 arrived at the 8th hour of the afternoon. When the scouting party returned from the tree line was a stand of stunted birch, perhaps 40 paces from the water, twisted by wind, no tree taller than a man, and one of the scouts, a young warrior named Haller, was carrying something in his 2 hands that he could not have found in a birch wood. He was carrying an iron chain link the size of a bull's neck. He set it on the sand at Grímr's feet. Grímr crouched to look at it. Asbjorn crouched with him. The rest of the crew gathered around. I gathered too, because a slave who does not gather when the crew gathers is a slave who is not paying attention, and a slave who is not paying attention on a strange shore does not live long. The link was iron. It was of a dark, granular iron, of a kind I had seen only once in my life, on the door of a reliquary at Armagh that was said to have been forged in the time of St. Patrick. The link was oval. The long axis was the length of my forearm, from elbow to knuckle. The short axis was the width of 2 hands laid side by side. The thickness of the iron was the thickness of my thumb. It weighed. I lifted it, later, when Grímr had left it on the sand, perhaps 4 stone. It was corroded on one face. On the other face, it was bright. I did not need to say what the corrosion asymmetry meant. Asbjorn said it. He was a sailor, and sailors know iron. He said, "This has been broken recently. The rust has not reached the break." Grímr said, "This is wrecked chain, from an older ship. Some Frisian trader broke apart on the headland, and the sea washed the chain onto the sand, and it broke on the rocks in the washing." Asbjorn said, "There is no wood on this beach, Grímr. If a ship broke here, there would be planks." Grímr said, "The planks are somewhere else on the coast. The chain is heavier than the planks. The chain came ashore where the planks did not." Asbjorn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, Grímr. The chain is heavier than the planks. The chain came ashore where the planks did not." He said it in the tone of a man who is agreeing with his captain in front of the crew and disagreeing with him in his own mind. And I noted the tone, because it was the first time on the voyage I had heard Asbjorn use it. I said nothing. I crouched by the link, and I turned it. And I put my hand on the bright face, the freshly broken face, and I felt what the sailors could not feel because they were standing back, and what Grímr had not felt because he had not touched it. The bright face was warm, not hot, warm. The temperature of blood cooled by an hour of standing. The same temperature as the water in the bay. I stood up. I went back to the water cask. I opened the Psalter to the 54th Psalm, and I wrote in the margin, in the small Latin, "Catena in harena, facies una vetus, facies altera nova, nova cale, nescio quid haec est, sed non est nihil." A chain in the sand, one face old, the other face new. The new face is warm. I do not know what this is, but it is not nothing. I closed the Psalter. I looked up. I saw Eyvinder watching me. He asked me in a low voice what I had written. I told him. He asked me, "If a chain is broken, what was on the other end of it?" I said, "That is the question, Eyvinder. That is the whole question." He said, "Do you have an answer?" I said, "I have a memory. My teacher on Iona, when I was a boy, told me a story about a chain on an island. I have not thought of the story in 15 years. I'm thinking of it now." He said, "Tell me the story." I said, "Not here, not yet. Tonight when the fire is low." He said, "Why not here?" I said, "Because if the story is true, it is not a story that should be spoken on the shore. It should be spoken at the fire, where the men can hear it and dismiss it, and where I can watch which of them dismisses it and which of them does not. That is what a slave learns, Eyvinder. A slave learns to watch which men dismiss which stories." He nodded. He was 17. He nodded like a boy who is being told, for the first time in his life, that there is a way of watching the world that his father has not taught him. I have thought many times, in the 61 years since, about the nod Eyvinder gave me on the beach that afternoon. He did not live long enough to teach the nod to a son of his own, but he learned it. In the last week of his life, he learned it. That is a small thing. It is one of the few small things from the voyage that I do not regret. I have said that a slave learns to watch which men dismiss which stories. I want to be honest about the story I told at the fire that night, because the account I'm dictating is an account of what I remembered, not an account of what I knew. And there is a difference between memory and knowledge. that a man in his 69th year understands better than a man in his 27th. I told the story of Brother Aiden, who had been my teacher on Iona from the 9th year of my life to the 25th. Aiden was 81 when he died, and he had died the winter before I was taken. He had been born on the west coast of Ireland, in a village whose name I never learned to pronounce, and he had come to Iona as a novice at the age of 14, and he had been at the monastery for 67 years when he died. He had been the archivist. He had known the old stories, the ones from before the coming of St. Patrick, the ones the monks did not repeat in the presence of visiting bishops, and he had told them to me in the scriptorium on winter evenings when the copying work was slow and the abbot had gone to bed. Aiden had told me, when I was perhaps 19 years old, the story of Cúna, the Hound of the Fire. He had told it in Old Irish, which was his first language and my second, and he had told it as a story that had been told to him by his own grandmother, who had heard it from a man who had heard it from a sailor. The chain of transmission, Aiden said, was 4 voices long from the sailor to me. That was longer than most stories, and it made the story less reliable, but not less worth remembering. The story, in the form Aiden told it, was this. Somewhere in the Western Sea, at a distance no boat had measured, there was an island on which fire lived in the ground. On the island, there was a hound. The hound was very large, and it had... Aiden had used a word here that I did not know at 19, and I had asked him about. And he had said the word meant more than one, without specifying how many more than one head. And the heads were of one animal. The hound was chained to the island. Aiden said the word for chained was cuibraic, which in Old Irish means a binding by a legal or sacred obligation, not merely a physical restraint. The hound had been chained by someone. Aiden did not know by whom. There were 2 versions of the story. In one version, the hound had been chained by an angel. In the other version, the hound had been chained by an older creature that the storyteller had no word for. And the angel version was the version that had come into the mouths of Christian tellers because they did not know what else to call the older creature. I asked Aiden at 19 which version he believed. He said he did not know which version he believed. He said he had been thinking about the story for 62 years, and he still did not know. He said that in his experience, when the Christian version of a story and the older version of a story disagreed, the older version was more often correct in the particulars, and the Christian version was more often correct in the meaning. I did not understand what he meant. I understood it later. I understood it, in fact, on the beach on the 6th day after landfall, when I read the 4th word on the Rune-Stone. But that is chapter 5, and I'm still in chapter 4, and I have not yet told you what Aiden said about the chain. Aiden said that the chain in the story was the point of the story. The hound was not the point. The chain was the point. The chain, in every version, the Christian version and the older version and the 3rd and 4th versions Aiden had heard from other archivists in his life, was described in the same way. It was iron. It was ancient. It was made in a place the storytellers did not name. And it was made for the specific purpose of keeping the hound on the island. And this was the phrase Aiden used in Old Irish. And I remember it exactly, because he made me repeat it back to him 3 times to be sure I would remember. And it was made so that when men came, the chain would not hold. I asked Aiden what that meant. Aiden said that the chain was not meant to hold forever. The chain was meant to hold until men arrived, and then the chain was meant to fail. The purpose of the chain, in the older version of the story, was not to protect men from the hound. The purpose of the chain was to protect the hound from a solitude that would have been longer than any binding could sustain. The chain was a courtesy. The chain was a mercy. The chain was there so that the hound would know, when it was broken, that the time had come. I asked Aiden what time. Aiden said he did not know. Aiden said no story he had heard had ever said what time. I asked Aiden finally whether the story was true. Eden said the following, which I quote from memory 61 years later. And I will not swear the words are exact, but I will swear the meaning is, Finton, I am 80 years old, and I have spent my life in a scriptorium, copying stories that men wrote down because they were afraid of forgetting them. I have never met a story that was written down without a reason. The story of the Hound of the Fire has been told by 4 voices between the sailor and me, and it has been told for at least 300 years, and no man who has told it has profited by telling it. That is not proof that it is true. That is only proof that the men who told it thought it was worth remembering. Whether it is true, you will not know until you go to the island. And if you go to the island, you will not come back to tell me. I did not tell Grímr this story on the beach that night. I told it to Eyvindr and Thorolfr and Asbjorn, at the small fire the crew had built at the base of the headland, out of driftwood we had found further along the shore. Grímr was not at the fire. Grímr was at the tree line with the main scouting party, planning the interior march for the following day. I told the story quietly, in Norse, and I told it in the way Eden had told it to me, with the 2 versions and the ambiguity. And when I was finished, Thorolfr, the sailor of 20 years, who had not spoken to me for the first 4 days of the voyage, said the following, Priest, the chain on the beach is the same iron as the chain in your story? I said, I do not know. I have not seen the chain in the story. I have seen the chain on the beach. He said, the chain on the beach is old iron. It is the iron of the reliquary at Armagh. It is not iron a Frisian trader would have carried. I said, no, it is not. He said, then it is not wrecked chain. I said, no, it is not. He said, then what has broken it? I said, that is the question, Thorolfr. That is the whole question. Asbjorn, who had been listening in silence, said, the captain has decided it is wrecked chain. The captain will not undecide it. I said, no, he will not. Asbjorn said, then we will march inland in the morning, and we will not think about the chain, and we will find whatever is inland to find, and we will come back to the ship. And if there is more than the chain to find, we will find it, and we will bring it to the captain, and the captain will look at it, and we will see whether the captain undecides. I said, yes, Asbjorn. He said, you are a slave, priest, but you are not a fool. Sit at this fire. Sleep near it tonight. Do not sleep at the water. The water is warm, and I do not like it. I sat at the fire. I slept near it. I did not sleep at the water. Eyvindr slept beside me. Thorolfr slept beside Eyvindr. Asbjorn slept between us and the tree line, with his axe under his hand. Grímr, when he came back from the scouting party, slept in a sleeping bag of sealskin at the base of the ship's prow, alone. I wrote in the margin of the 68th Psalm at some hour of the night when the fire had burned to coals, and I could see by the coals well enough to write, Eden habut dictum, catena facta est ut sederit quando homines venirent. Homines venerunt. Catena cessit. Eden said, the chain was made to fail when men came. Men have come, the chain has failed. I did not sleep after I wrote that. I lay on the sand near the fire with my hand on the psalter under my cloak, and I listened to the sea in the warm bay, and I listened to the silence in the birch wood where the birds were not, and I understood, for the first time in the 22 months of my slavery, that Grímr Ironshank had bought me for a reason he did not yet know. The reason was on the beach. The reason was in my memory. The reason was in a story a dead man had told me 8 years before. On a winter evening, in a scriptorium on an island in a sea that was not this sea. We marched inland at the first hour after dawn, on the 12th day since departure, which was the 2nd day on the island. Grímr took 18 men. He left 12 on the ship, under Asbjorn's command, with orders to hold the beach and to be ready to push off at short notice if the interior party returned in haste. I was among the 18. Grímr took me because I could read, and he had not yet decided whether the story I had told at the fire was worth crediting. And he wanted me where he could hear me, if I was going to be worth crediting. The interior of the island, in the 2 days we traversed it, is not the subject of this chapter. I will describe it briefly, because to describe it at length would be to violate the pacing I have set myself, which is the pacing of a man who is dying and has learned to say only the things that matter. The interior was black. The rock was volcanic, a dark, porous stone I had not seen in my life, though I had read of it in Pliny, and the earth between the rocks was thin. There were 3 streams. The water in all 3 streams was cold, which was a relief, because the sea in the bay had been warm. There were plants, a low ground-hugging heather, a species of moss the color of copper, and stands of the same stunted birch we had seen on the shore. There were no animals, not one, not a hare, not a fox, not a rat, not a beetle turning over in a wet leaf. 18 men crossed the interior for 2 days and saw not one animal. And we did not name this at the time, because the absence of a thing is harder to notice than the presence of a thing. And we were tired, and Grímr was moving us at a pace that did not permit a great deal of noticing. We found the Rune-Stone on the afternoon of the 2nd day of the march, the 13th day since departure, in a shallow valley perhaps 2 leagues inland from the beach. The valley had been, at some past time, a channel for lava. The lava had cooled, and the channel had become a dry riverbed of black stone, and along the eastern edge of the channel half swallowed by the lava, so that only its upper third stood clear, was a stone. It was not a lava stone. It was granite. It was pale gray, streaked with the lighter gray of quartz, and it had been carved by a hand. It stood so far as the lava had left it standing, perhaps to the height of a man's chest. Its top was rounded. It was, in its shape, unmistakably a stele, a memorial stone, or a boundary stone, or a warning stone. It was not Norse work. It was not Irish work. It was not any work I had ever seen. Grímr called me to it. I came. I knelt in front of it. I put my hand on the runes. The runes were not runes. They were characters of a kind I had not seen. They were angular and deep-cut, but the geometry was not the geometry of any Futhark I knew, nor of any Ogham, nor of any Latin. They were something older, or they were something from a place I did not know. I could not read them, except that I could read 3 of them. At the top of the stele, in 3 characters that stood apart from the rest, separated by a small circle carved above and below them, were 3 shapes I recognized. I recognized them because Iona had once shown me a fragment of a manuscript in the archive at Iona that had been brought from a monastery in Gaul in the time of Charlemagne's father. And the fragment had contained a marginal drawing of a chain, and beneath the chain 3 characters. And Iona had told me that the characters were older than any writing in Ireland or in Britain or in Gaul, and that they were said to mean 3 specific things when they were placed together. Iona had taught me the 3 things. I had never expected to see the characters again. I read them aloud to Grímr, and to Asbjorn. Asbjorn had come inland with us for the Rune-Stone, leaving Thorolfur in command of the beach, and to Eyvindr, and to the 15 other men. And I read them in Latin because Latin was the only language in which I trusted myself to speak precisely. I said, "Ligatus dormio." No. Grímr said, "In Norse, priest." I said, "In Norse, bound, sleeping, do not." Grímr said, "Do not what?" I said, "There is a 4th character. It is below the lava. I cannot read it without clearing the lava." Grímr said, "Clear the lava." I cleared the lava. I did not clear it alone. Eyvindr cleared it with me, on his knees beside me, with a knife and a stone he had picked up from the channel bed. It took us the remainder of the afternoon and into the first hour of the evening. Grímr stood over us. Asbjorn walked the perimeter of the valley with 3 men and returned to us at intervals. and said each time that there was no sign of anything and that we should hurry. Grímr did not hurry us. He watched us. At the first hour of the evening, I cleared the lava from the fourth character. The character was cut into the stone at the same depth as the others, and it was clean, and it was legible to me because I had seen it too, in Aiden's manuscript fragment. And Aiden had taught me the fourth word as well as the first three, though he had taught it separately. And he had told me that the fourth word almost never appeared in the sequence, and that when it appeared, the sequence changed meaning in a way that the archivists of Gaul had disagreed about for 2 centuries. The fourth word was wake. I read the 4 words aloud, in Latin and then in Norse. I said, legatus dormiens non excita. I said, bound, sleeping, do not wake. Grímr was silent for a long time. It was the first silence I had heard from him since the voyage began. Then he said in Norse, stand up, priest. I stood up. He said, you are telling me that this stone was put here to warn men not to wake a sleeping thing that is bound on this island. I said, I am telling you what the 4 characters say. What the characters mean is a separate question. I am not the man who can answer it. He said, who put the stone here? I said, I do not know. He said, when? I said, I do not know. The lava has covered 2/3 of the stone. The lava, from the flow lines I can see in the channel, is not recent. The stone was here before the lava. The lava was here before us. The stone is older than the lava. The lava is older than my grandfather's grandfather. I do not know how much older the stone is than that. He said, you are guessing. I said, I am reading. The stone was cut before the lava flowed over it. The lava is old. Therefore, the stone is older. That is not a guess. That is a sequence. He said, a slave does not tell a captain the difference between a guess and a sequence. I said, yes, captain. I ask your pardon. He said, break the stone. I said, captain? He said, break the stone. If there is more writing under the lava, I want it. Break the stone open. I did not break the stone. Eyvinder did not break the stone. Asbjorn did not break the stone. 3 of Grímr's own men, on his order, took axes to the stone, and the axes did not break it. The axes chipped, and then they dulled, and then one of them cracked at the neck, and the man holding it, a warrior named Kolbein, cursed and stepped back with a shard of iron in his forearm. 3 axes were ruined. The stone was not marked. The characters were not chipped. The stone stood in the lava as it had stood before we came, and the 4 words stood on it, and the lava had held its silence, for however many centuries it had held it. And the men were tired, and Grímr was angry. And Grímr said, after the 3rd axe had failed, leave it, leave the stone. We march back to the shore. We marched tonight. We marched back to the shore. It took us the whole of the night. We arrived at the beach at first light on the 14th day since departure, the 4th day on the island, and Thorolfr met us at the water with a face I did not like. And he said before Grímr could speak, Captain, something was around the camp in the night. Grímr said, a bear. Thorolfr said, no, Captain, not a bear. Grímr said, what? Thorolfr said, I do not know, but it was around the camp, and it was breathing. I want to say something now about how I remember what Thorolfr told us at first light on the 14th day, because the memory is not clean, and I have promised myself, in the writing of this account, not to make my memories cleaner than they were. Thorolfr told us, at the water's edge, that something had been around the camp in the night. I have written it above as a single exchange, brief and clear, because that is the shape memory takes when it is 61 years old. Memory becomes summary. What actually happened was longer. Thorolfr said the words I have written, but he said them slowly, and he stopped between the sentences, and he looked out to sea while he was speaking. and the 12 men who had held the beach were standing behind him in a loose line. And none of them were looking at Grímr. They were looking at their feet. Grímr understood, from the way the 12 men were looking at their feet, that Thorolfr was not exaggerating. He understood also, from Thorolfr's face, that whatever had happened in the night had happened in a way that Thorolfr, a sailor of 20 years, who was not a man who imagined things could not explain. Grímr said, "Show me." Thorolfr led us up the beach, past the fire which was still smoldering, though at a low ash, to the tree line, and along the tree line for perhaps 40 paces to the north. And there, in the sand at the base of a stunted birch, he stopped and pointed at the ground. The ground was pressed. It was not a track. A track would have been the mark of a foot moving. This was the mark of a foot standing, or of a foot resting. The sand had been compressed in a rough oval, perhaps 3 ells long and 2 ells wide. And at the front of the oval, the end nearest the tree, the sand had been pressed into 4 shallow depressions in a fan. The depressions were the marks of 4 claws. The claws had rested on the sand. They had not dug into it. They had not scraped. They had simply rested. I stood at the edge of the oval and looked at it. I did not step into it. Grímr stepped into it, and he crouched, and he put his hand on one of the claw marks, and he spread his fingers, and his hand, Grímr Ironshank, had a large hand, the hand of a 44-year-old warrior, and I had seen him grip an ox's horn in both hands and turn the animal's head. His hand did not reach from one edge of a single claw mark to the other. He stood up. He did not speak. He turned to Thorolfr. Thorolfr said, "It was here for a long time, Captain. The sand under the paw is warm." Grímr said, "Warm." Thorolfr said, "Warm, Captain. Put your hand on it." Grímr did not put his hand on it. Grímr said, "When?" Thorolfr said, "The middle watch, between the 3rd and 4th hours after midnight." I was on watch. I heard the breathing. Grímr said, "Describe the breathing." Thorolfr said, "There were 3 of them, Captain. 3 breaths at 3 different pitches. 1 low, 1 middle, 1 high. They were not in time with each other, but they were close to being in time. They were the breathing of 3 creatures, close together, breathing in and out. And the breathing was slow. Slower than a man's, slower than a dog's. I have heard cattle breathe like that in a byre in winter, when they are all lying down. But this was not cattle. This was slower than cattle, and it was outside the tree line, and it was as loud as if the creatures had been 6 paces from me. Grímr said, 3 creatures. Thorolfr said, 3 breaths, Captain. I did not say 3 creatures. I said 3 breaths. I noted the correction. Grímr did not. Grímr said, "And you did not go to look." Thorolfr said, "No, Captain. I did not go to look. I woke Asbjorn. Asbjorn heard the breathing also. Asbjorn ordered the watch doubled and the fire built up. We built the fire up. The breathing stopped when the fire was built up. It did not come back." Grímr said, "A bear in a cave. There is a cave in the cliff above us. A bear was in the cave, and the sound was echoed. That is why it sounded like 3. Thorolfr said quietly, "Captain, there is no cave in the cliff above us. I have looked. There is no cave for a league in either direction along the shore." Grímr said, "Then it was a bear in the trees." Thorolfr said, "A bear does not leave a paw print that a captain's hand does not span, Captain." Grímr was silent. He looked at the paw print. He looked at Thorolfr. He looked at the 12 men behind Thorolfr, who had all now looked up from their feet and were watching him. He said at last, "Double the watch. Build the fire high. We will not march inland again. We will hold the beach for 2 days. I want to know what is in the trees before we do anything else. Thorolfr, you and Asbjorn and I will walk the tree line at midday and at dusk. Priest." He turned to me. He said, "Priest, You will come to the tree line with us. If there are more marks, I want you to read them. Can you read marks? I said, I can measure marks, Captain. I can describe them. I cannot read them the way I read runes, because they are not writing. But I can describe them precisely. He said, Then describe them precisely. If you see anything I do not see, you say so. If you say so and I dismiss you, and you were right, I will remember it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I said, Yes, Captain. He said, I do not know what I'm telling you. He said this last sentence quietly, and I do not think he meant for the crew to hear it. But Eyvinder heard it, and Thorolf heard it, and Asbjorn heard it, and I heard it. And in the 61 years since, I have thought about that sentence more than I have thought about almost anything else Grímr Ironshank said in his life. It was the first sentence he ever spoke in my presence that admitted the possibility that he did not know what he was doing. He would not speak such a sentence again. 4 days later, he would charge a creature the height of a longship's mast with an axe in his hand. And he would die in front of the shield wall. And he would go into the ground without ever having admitted, in words, what he admitted in that one quiet sentence at the tree line on the morning of the 14th day. We walked the tree line at midday. We found no more marks. We walked it again at dusk. We found 4 more marks, 4 more pressed ovals, 4 more fans of claws, spaced along the tree line at intervals of perhaps 40 paces, in the exact positions from which a creature standing in the trees could observe the entire length of the beach. The creature or the creatures had been posted around the camp on all sides at watchful distance for the length of a night, breathing. I wrote on the 14th night, in the margin of the 77th Psalm, Pauca circumstant, non impetum fecerunt, observaverunt, hoc peius est. Something surrounded us. They did not attack, they watched. This is worse. We doubled the watch. We built the fire high. The breathing did not come back on the 14th night. It came back on the 15th night. This time, one of the watchmen went to look for it. His name was Halldor. He was 22 years old. He was the son of a widow in Hordaland, and he had come on the voyage because his mother's farm could not support him and his brother had drawn the longer piece of grass on the morning of the choosing. And Halldor had drawn the shorter piece, and Halldor had gone to sea. He was on the 2nd watch of the 15th night, from the 6th to the 9th hour after nightfall, and he heard the breathing at the 7th hour. And he did not wake Asbjorn. He walked toward it. He walked into the tree line, with a spear. We found him at first light. He was lying in the sand at the base of a birch on his back, uninjured. He was awake. His eyes were open. His spear was gone. Across his chest, from his right shoulder to his left hip, was pressed the mark of a paw. The paw had been laid on him. It had not scratched him. It had not cut him. It had held him. The 4 claw marks of the paw's front edge had come to rest just at the base of his throat, and the pad of the paw had covered his sternum and his belly. And Halldor had lain under the paw, for he could not say for how long. He said he had been unable to move. He said he had not been afraid. He said this was the strange part. He had not been afraid. He said that when the paw lifted, the creature had not moved away. It had stayed above him for a long time, breathing, and he had felt the breath on his face, and it had smelled of iron and of ash. And then the creature had turned, and he had heard it walk back into the trees, and then he had slept. And he had woken at first light, with the mark still pressed on his chest and his spear still gone. Grímr listened to Halldor's account in silence. When Halldor was finished, Grímr said only, "Where is your spear, Halldor?" Halldor said, "I do not know, Captain. It was in my hand." Then it was not in my hand. Grímr said, "Did the creature take it?" Halldor said, "I do not know, Captain. I could not turn my head to see." Grímr said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You will stay at the fire today. You will not stand a watch tonight. Priest." He turned to me. He said, "Write down what he said, word for word, in whatever language you write in. Just write it down." I wrote it down. I have it still, in the margin of the 88th Psalm, and it is the longest single entry in the account, and it is written in a hand less steady than my hand was in the entries before it. That is the only entry in the Psalter of which I can say that the shaking of my hand at the time of writing is still visible on the page. I wrote, at the end of the entry, "Potuit occidere, non occidit, non intelligo." It could have killed. It did not kill. I do not understand. I did not understand then. I understood on the 7th day, on the black sand of the shore. I did not understand fully even then. I understand now, 61 years later, only that the paw on Haldor's chest on the 15th night was the same choice as the passing over of me on the 7th day, and that both were choices, and that the creature had begun making its choices long before we saw it, and that the arithmetic of the voyage 32 men, 6 men, 1 slave, was the arithmetic not of what the creature took, but of what the creature elected to leave. I've not been sleeping well since I began this account. The infirmarian has noticed. He believes I'm dying. He is correct, but he believes I'm dying in the ordinary way of a man in his 69th year. And I am not, or rather, I am dying in the ordinary way. But the writing of the account is not making the dying easier. And I have not told him why, and I will not, because the account is not for him. I mention this because chapter 7 is the chapter in which the creature is seen. Not fully. The full seeing is chapter 8. Chapter 7 is the chapter of the shape. And I have found, in the writing of chapter 7 over the last 2 nights, that my hand refuses the description in a way it has not refused any other passage. I have therefore decided to write chapter 7 briefly. I will describe what I saw. I will describe what Grímr saw. I will not describe what I felt, because what I felt is not evidence, and the account is an account of evidence. On the 16th day since departure, the 6th day on the island, Grímr ordered a party of 6 men, under Asbjorn's command, to enter the tree line and to walk parallel to the beach at a distance of 10 paces inside the trees, and to look for what had made the paw marks and the breathing. He did not enter the tree line himself. He stayed on the beach. He kept me with him. The party entered the trees at midday. They came out at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, 1 league to the north of the ship, on a small rise of black stone that overlooked the beach. Asbjorn signaled with a cloth. Grímr signaled back. The party turned and walked south along the beach, on the sand, to rejoin us. Asbjorn reported, when he returned, "Captain, there is nothing in the trees. No marks, no signs, no droppings, nothing." Grímr said, "Nothing." Asbjorn said, "Nothing that we could see." Grímr said, "But," Asbjorn said, "but the birds are not there either. There should be at least jackdaws. There are no birds. And the trees are pressed, Captain, in places, as if something had leaned against them. Not broken them, leaned against them. The bark on the west sides of some of the birches is smoothed, as if something the size of an ox has been leaning against them." Grímr said, "Where?" Asbjorn said, "In 4 places, spaced along the tree line, in the 4 places nearest to the 4 paw marks from the 14th night." Grímr said, quietly, "So it stands in the trees, and it leans on them while it watches us." Asbjorn said, "Yes, Captain, I believe so." Grímr said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Tonight I will stand a watch. I will stand the 2nd watch. Priest, you will stand with me." I said, "Yes, Captain." I stood with him, from the 6th hour after nightfall to the 9th hour. We stood on the beach, at the edge of the fire, facing the tree line. The fire was high. The other watchmen were spaced along the beach at intervals. Grímr had his axe in his hand. I had nothing in mine. I did not carry a weapon on the voyage. I was a slave. Slaves did not carry. At the 7th hour, the breathing began. I heard it before Grímr did. I heard it because I had been listening for it for 2 nights, and Grímr had not. It was 3 breaths at 3 pitches, low and middle and high. And they were slow, and they were in the tree line, perhaps 30 paces in front of us. I did not point. I said quietly, "Captain." Grímr said, "I hear it." We stood. We listened. The breathing did not move. It stayed in one position for perhaps a quarter of an hour. And then it moved. I heard the pressure of it shift perhaps 10 paces to the north. And then, at the 8th hour, in the space between 2 of the birches at the edge of the tree line, I saw the eyes. There were 2 of them. They were the color of a hearth coal seen through the crack of a door. They were the color of iron, heated to the point at which a smith can bend it. They were not in one head. They were spaced too far apart for one head. They were at a height above the ground I measured it, from the height of the second birch on the left of my sight line, which I had measured that morning. Because Asbjorn had told me to measure things, the eyes were at a height of 1.5 times the height of a man. They were not moving. They were looking at us. I said quietly, "Captain, there are 2 eyes at head height of 1.5 men, left of the fire, between the 2nd and 3rd birches from the north." Grímr said, "I see them." I said, "There is a 3rd eye." Grímr said, "Where?" I said, "At the same height, to the left of the 2, half open or half turned. I'm not sure." Grímr said, "There are 3 eyes." I said, "There are 3 eyes, Captain. Perhaps more. I can see 3. I did not say more than that. I did not describe what I could see behind the eyes, which was a shape that shifted in the darkness, and which was not the shape of a single animal, and which was, I will say this, and then I will not say more, which was tall, taller than the birches. The birches were the height of 1.5 men. The shape was the height of 2 men, at least. Its shoulder was above the crowns of the trees. I say I did not say more than that. And it is true that I did not say more to Grímr in that moment. What I said in the Psalter later that night was, "Vidi, tria oculos, umbra super arbores, non abaiet, non venit, stetit." I saw 3 eyes, a shadow above the trees. It did not go. It did not come. It stood. Grímr and I stood on the beach for the remainder of the 2nd watch. The eyes did not move. The breathing did not stop. At the 9th hour, when the watch changed, Grímr turned to me and said, "Priest, do not speak of what you saw. Not to Asbjorn, not to Thorolf, not to Eyvindr, not to any man of the crew. You will not speak of what you saw until I have decided what to do." I said, "Yes, Captain." He said, "You saw 3 eyes." I said, "Yes, Captain." He said, "That is not a bear." I said, "No, Captain, it is not." He said, "You know what it is." I said, "I know a story. I do not know if the story and the thing in the trees are the same thing. I know only that I read 4 words on a stone 2 days ago. And one of the words was wake, and the stone was too old to break with 3 axes. And there is a chain on the shore that was broken recently. And there is a thing in the trees the size of 2 men that has 3 eyes and does not attack. I know these facts. I do not know what they mean together. But you know what they mean, Captain. You know as well as I do." Grímr was silent. Then he said, "Priest, at first light we go to the beach. We put the men on the ship. We push off. We go home. This voyage is finished." I said, "Yes, Captain." But it was not finished. Grímr had underestimated something. He had underestimated the amount of time it would take, at first light, to get 28 men and their gear onto a longship, pulled up on a beach with a keel wedged into black sand that had baked in the sun for 6 days. He had underestimated the tide. He had underestimated, above all, the readiness of the thing in the trees to permit a departure. At first light on the 17th day since departure, the 7th day on the island, the thing came out of the trees. And the thing had been waiting, I now understand, for Grímr to decide to leave. Because a creature that is territorial does not attack a trespasser who is trespassing. It attacks a trespasser who is leaving with something it has not returned. We had not returned the chain link. That is chapter 8. That is the shore. I will now describe what happened on the beach at first light on the 7th day. I will describe it in the order in which it happened, and I will not describe what I felt, because as I said in chapter 7, what I felt is not evidence. I will describe only what I saw, and I will say now, before I begin, that the account of chapter 8 is the account for which the Psalter was made. Everything else in the Psalter was preparation for this entry. Everything else in the 61 years since was interpretation of it. At first light, the tide was 3/4 out. The keel of the longship was wedged into the sand at a depth of perhaps 2 spans. Grímr ordered the ship pushed off. 28 men, the 28 of us then living, put our shoulders and our poles and our ropes to the ship. The ship moved. It moved slowly. It moved perhaps 1 ell in a quarter of an hour of pushing. The sand was reluctant. The ship was heavy. The tide was against us. At the 3rd quarter of the 1st hour of daylight, when the ship had moved perhaps 2 ells and was still wedged, Asbjorn came to Grímr and said, "Captain, we will not be off before the sun is high. We will not be off before mid-afternoon at this rate." Grímr said, "Then keep pushing." Asbjorn said, "Captain, we should consider abandoning gear. The provisions can be replaced. The men will not be replaced." Grímr said, "We do not abandon gear on a beach we do not intend to return to. Keep pushing." At the 1st hour of full daylight, the creature came out of the trees. I did not see it come out. I was at the stern of the ship, on the seaward side, with my shoulder to the strake. I heard it. I heard the trees. There was a sound of the birches parting, not breaking, parting, and then a sound of a footfall on sand. And then the men on the landward side of the ship stopped pushing, and the ship settled back into the sand. And I heard Grímr, on the landward side, say a word I had never heard him say. It was not a Norse word. It was not a word at all. It was a sound. I went around the stern. I came around the ship. I saw. I will describe what I saw. The creature was standing at the tree line, perhaps 40 paces from the ship. It was taller than I had estimated in the darkness. I had estimated 2 men. It was 3. It stood on 4 legs, and the 4 legs were the legs of a hound. And the paws were the paws that had made the marks in the sand. And the shoulders were the shoulders of an ox, but larger. And the body was the body of a dog, covered in a coat of black fur. That was not fur in the ordinary way. The fur was long and coarse, and, on the shoulders and the neck, matted into ropes that lay against the flanks, like the ropes of an old sail. The creature had more than 1 head. I will not tell you how many. I have been asked this in dreams and in prayer, and in the 2 conversations I had, in the 61 years since, with men who somehow knew to ask, and I have never answered. What I saw, on the beach at first light on the 7th day, in the light of the morning sun on the tree line, was a creature that had more than 1 head, and the heads were of 1 animal, and the heads moved independently on the shoulders, and yet together on the body. I saw, in the moment I came around the stern, 2 heads clearly, and a shape behind the shoulder that resolved and unresolved. I will not tell you whether the shape behind the shoulder was a 3rd head. I will say only that the story Aiden told me used the word more than 1, and Aiden did not specify, and neither will I. The eyes of the heads I could see were the color of a hearth coal seen through the crack of a door. The mouths of the heads I could see were open, and the teeth were long, and the teeth were irregular, and the tongues were black. around the neck of the shoulders, around the base of all the heads together. Where the heads joined, the body hung the chain. The chain was iron. It was of the same iron as the link we had found on the sand on the first afternoon. It was the iron of the reliquary at Armagh. It hung from the creature's neck in a broken loop, and the last link of the loop, the link at which the chain had broken, was bright on its inner face. Bright the way the link in the sand had been bright. The chain had been broken from that ring, from around that neck, at a time not long before we had arrived. I understood, in the seeing, that the link on the sand was one link. The link around the creature's neck was another. Between them, somewhere on the island, or under the lava, or in the sea, were the links of the chain that had once run from the neck to the shore. And the chain had bound the creature to the shore, and the chain had failed, and the failure was recent, and the failure had been prepared for. Grímr, on the landward side of the ship, took his axe in both hands and stepped forward from the ship. He walked toward the creature. He walked slowly. He was not running. He was walking. I have thought about this many times. Grímr Ironshank did not run at the creature. He walked at it. And I believe now I did not believe it then. I have come to believe it in the 61 years since that Grímr walked, because he understood, in the seeing of the creature, that a running man would be a fleeing man. And a fleeing man in front of a creature that size was already dead. And a walking man was the last man on that beach, with dignity. Grímr walked to within 20 paces of the creature. He stopped. He raised his axe. He said in Norse, in a voice that was steady, "I am the captain of this ship. I am the one who brought them here. If you take a man, take me." He said it once. He did not say it twice. He walked forward 5 more paces. The creature lowered one of its heads. The head that lowered was the head on the right of the body, from my point of view. The head lowered to the level of Grímr's shoulder. The mouth of the head opened. The teeth were the length of my forearm. Grímr swung the axe. I saw him swing. I saw the axe strike. I saw the axe strike at the base of the lowered head, at the throat, where a smith would strike an animal to kill it. The axe struck. The axe rebounded. The axe did not enter. Grímr staggered from the rebound. The head that had lowered raised itself again, unharmed, and the mouth closed, and the second head, the head on the left of the body, lowered, and it took Grímr in the chest. It took him in the chest. It did not tear him. It took him. It closed on him, from the collarbone to the belt, and it lifted him from the sand. Grímr made no sound. I will say this for him. He made no sound. The creature lifted him to a height of 2 men above the sand, and it held him there for the space of 2 breaths, and then it lowered him, and it laid him on the sand at the base of the tree line, and it stood over him. Grímr was not moving. I could not tell at that distance whether he was dead. I have come to believe, in the 61 years since, that he was dead in the closing of the mouth, and that the 2 breaths of lifting were the 2 breaths in which the creature carried the body of the man who had walked into it. The shield wall formed on the beach. I did not form it. I could not. I was a slave. I had no shield. I stood at the stern of the ship. Eyvindr was in the wall. Thorolfr was in the wall. Asbjorn was at the center of the wall, because Asbjorn was now the captain, and the captain stands at the center. There were 26 shields. There were 26 men, because one, a young man named Svein, had run for the ship, and Asbjorn had let him go, because a man in the wall who does not want to be in the wall is a hole in the wall. The creature raised its heads from Grímr's body. It looked at the wall. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because it is the reason I'm alive. The creature walked. It did not charge. It walked on 4 legs, from the tree line to the shield wall, and the walking took the space of perhaps 20 of my heartbeats. And during the walking, the heads of the creature, the 2, I could see clearly. and the shape behind the shoulder that I could not name turned. The heads turned along the line of the wall. They looked at each man in the wall. They looked at Asbjorn at the center. They looked at Eyvindr at the third position from the right. They looked at Thorolfr at the fifth position from the left. They looked at Halldor, who had been laid under the paw on the 15th night at the far right of the line. Halldor had come off the ship for the shield wall. I saw the heads look at Halldor, and I saw one of the heads pause, and I saw the head, I believe the middle head, but I will not swear it. I saw the head lower slightly towards Halldor, and I saw Halldor in the wall kneel. He knelt in the wall. He set his shield down. He knelt on the sand. He put his forehead to the sand. The head above him did not open its mouth. The head turned. It looked at the next man in the wall. It looked at each man in turn. And I saw, one by one, along the wall I saw first Halldor kneel. And then 2 of the men next to Halldor knelt. And then 3 of the men next to them. And by the time the heads had walked the length of the wall, 12 of the 26 men in the wall were on their knees. 14 were standing. The creature stopped at the center of the wall, opposite Asbjorn. Asbjorn did not kneel. Asbjorn was the captain. Asbjorn stood. The creature looked at Asbjorn for the space of 5 breaths. I counted the breaths. I count them still. 5. Then the creature turned its heads away from Asbjorn, and it walked past the wall, and it walked toward the ship. It walked toward the ship. It walked toward the stern. It walked toward me. I did what Halldor had done. I knelt. I did not have a shield. I did not have a wall. I had the sand of the beach at the stern of the ship, and I had the psalter beneath my cloak, and I had the memory of Aiden, who had told me I remembered this only in the kneeling. I had not remembered it in chapter 4. I remember it now, and I write it now. And I will not swear I remembered it in the moment, but I will swear I acted on it. Eden had told me that the older versions of the story described the men who came to the island in 2 categories. And one category was the category of the men who had come to take, and the other category was the category of the men who had come knowing they had no right to be there. And the second category, in the older versions, was the category that walked away. I knelt. I put my forehead to the sand. I did not close my eyes. I looked at the sand under my forehead, and I saw the grains of the black sand. And I heard the footfalls of the creature come around the stern of the ship, and I heard the footfalls stop. I heard the breathing. 3 breaths, low, middle, high. They were above me. They were at a distance from my head that I could not measure by the sound, because the breaths were so slow and so deep that the distance was not in the sound. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. It smelled of iron and of ash. It smelled of the ash on the water. It smelled of what I had smelled on my fingers on the 9th day of the crossing. The breathing stopped, not stopped held. The creature held its breath. I held mine. I did not know that I had held mine until later, when Eyvindr told me that I had knelt for the space of 11 of his heartbeats without breathing, and that he had thought I was dead. The creature exhaled. The breath went over my head. The sand in front of my forehead moved. The grains moved forward, away from my face, in a small line. The creature turned. I heard the paws turn in the sand. I heard the creature walk. I heard it walk past the ship. I heard it walk to the water. I heard the water take the paws. I heard the creature walk into the water. And I heard the water rise on the flanks. And I heard the water rise on the shoulders. And I heard the water rise to the base of the necks, and I heard the water stop rising. I heard the creature stand in the water. I raised my head. The creature was standing in the water to the depth of its chest. It was facing the horizon. It was not looking at us. It was looking at the sea. The chain around its neck hung in the water, and the broken end of the chain floated on the water, and the broken end of the chain drifted with the tide. Asbjorn, at the center of the shield wall, understood before I did. He turned to the men, and he said, "Push the ship. Push it now. Push it as fast as you have ever pushed anything in your lives. Push." We pushed. 26 men and 1 slave. The men who had knelt stood, and the men who had stood knelt to the pushing. And we put the whole of our weight to the ship, and the ship came free of the sand in the space of 5 heartbeats, and the ship slid into the surf, and the men climbed aboard over the strakes, and the oars went into the water, and we rowed. We rowed past the creature. The creature was standing in the water to the depth of its chest. It did not turn its heads to us. It did not lift a paw. As the ship rowed past it at a distance of perhaps 30 paces, the creature stood in the shallows, and we rowed through the deeper channel at the mouth of the bay. The creature did not move. We rowed past it. We rowed out of the bay. At the headland, at the edge of the bay, where the water becomes open sea, I looked back. I was on the starboard oar bench, and I could look back over my shoulder. I looked back. The creature was still standing in the water. But now, at the headland, as the ship crossed the invisible line, where the bay becomes the sea, the creature turned. It turned in the water. It walked back to the shore. It walked out of the water. It walked up the beach. It walked to the tree line. It walked to the body of Grímr Ironshank. It stood over the body. It stood there. It did not lie down. It did not lift the body. It did not touch it. It stood over Grímr Ironshank at the base of the tree line on the black sand of the shore, and it faced the sea, and it watched us row. I watched it back. I watched it until the headland cut off the view. I watched it for the space of perhaps a quarter of an hour of rowing, and when the headland cut off the view, the creature was still standing over the body of Grímr Ironshank, and the fire on the cliffs above the tree line. I have not mentioned the fire in this chapter, because the fire had been there all along since the 6th night, and I had ceased to notice that the fire on the cliffs above the tree line was still burning, and the creature and the fire and the body of Grímr Ironshank were the last thing I saw of the island. We rowed east, 6 Norsemen and a slave. 26 men were left on the beach. 25 were dead. 1 Grímr Ironshank was under the watch of the creature that had killed him, and had chosen not to kill the rest of us. I wrote that night, at sea, in the margin of the 91st Psalm, with a hand that shook so that the writing is barely legible in the Psalter today. Occidit unum, non occidit alteros, elegit me, nescio quaer. It killed 1. It did not kill the others. It chose. It chose me. I do not know why. I will describe the row east briefly. The 61 years since have taught me that the row east is not the part of the account that matters, and that the discipline of a dying man is to write only what matters. We rowed for 11 days, on the same heading by which we had come, in reverse. Asbjorn set the course by the pole star at night, and by the sun at midday, and Asbjorn was a good navigator, and the ship held. The wind was against us for the first 4 days, and with us for the last 7. We ate what remained of the provisions. There was not enough. On the 5th day, a young oarsman named Snorri, he had knelt in the wall on the beach. He was one of the 12 died in his sleep. We put him over the side with a prayer that Asbjorn spoke, and I do not remember the words of the prayer. But I remember that Asbjorn spoke it in a voice that was different from the voice he had used before the beach. On the 8th day, a second man, a warrior called Ketil, who had stood in the wall and not knelt, died of a wound I had not known he had. He had taken a cut on the thigh during the pushing of the ship, and the cut had gone bad in the wet of the crossing, and he died in a fever, and we put him over also. That is why the count is 6 and not 8. 26 men and a slave came off the beach. 6 men and the slave reached shore. We reached shore on the 22nd day since departure, not at Kirkwall. Asbjorn had not made for Kirkwall. He had made for the coast of Hordaland, which was a longer sail, because he did not want to arrive in Orkney, where the Jarls would ask questions, and he did want to arrive in his own home settlement, where the questions could be shaped by the men who were asking them. We landed at Skjalgstadir at the 3rd hour of the afternoon of the 11th of Solmanudur. The settlement was 32 houses in size, and 32 of us had left, and it is a coincidence in the arithmetic I have thought about often. There were 47 longhouses in total, some of them belonging to families whose men had not been on the voyage. But of the 32 houses whose men were on the ship, only 6 had reason to open their doors that afternoon. Asbjorn ordered the ship burned the following morning. He gave the order in front of the 6 of us and no one else. He said that the marks on the hull, the marks the creature had made when it walked past the ship to the water, marks I had not seen in the pushing, but which had been on the outer strake at the stern, 4 gouges, each 2 fingers deep, in oak, could not be seen by any man of the settlement who had not been on the beach. The men agreed. I did not agree. I did not disagree. I was a slave. I was not asked. The ship was burned at first light. I took a fragment of the strake planking from the ashes the following night, when the ashes were cool. It was no larger than a psalm book. It bore, on its inner face, 4 parallel gouges cut into oak 2 fingers deep. I have kept it for 61 years. It is in the reliquary of this monastery, in a small wooden box that the sub-prior believes contains a piece of the bone of Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne. It does not contain a piece of the bone of Saint Aidan. It contains a piece of a Norse longship. When I am dead, the sub-prior will discover this, and I do not know what he will do with it. I hope he will keep it. I hope he will not burn it. It is the only physical proof of the voyage that exists on this earth. And if it is burned, the account is only my word, and my word is the word of a slave. I lived at Skjalgstadir for 2 years. I was granted my freedom in the 2nd year by Asbjorn, who had taken command of Grímr's household, and who was, I came to understand, a different man from the man he had been before the beach. He gave me my freedom, and he gave me a passage on a Frisian ship bound for Frisia. And from Frisia I made my own way, a long way, and I will not describe it, to the coast of Northumbria, and to the monastery at Lindisfarne, where I was received as a brother and where I have remained for 59 years. Of the 6 Norsemen who rowed east with me, Asbjorn lived the longest, 21 years after the beach. Thorolfr lived 9 years and died in a raid on the coast of Alba, and I do not know whether he ever spoke of the beach to any man. Eyvindr, who was 17 on the voyage, Eyvindr lived to be 41. He came to Lindisfarne once, in the 12th year after the beach, and he stayed with me for 4 days, and we spoke of the beach for the whole of the 4 days, and it was the only time in my life that I spoke of the beach aloud to another man who had been there. He asked me, at the end of the 4 days, whether I understood why the creature had let us go. I told him what I have told you, that I did not know. He asked me whether I believed Aidan's story. I told him I believed Aidan. That was not the same as believing the story. He said he understood the difference. He rode away the following morning, and I never saw him again. And I heard 14 years later that he had died of a fall from a horse in the country north of Trondheim, and that his last words had been in Latin, and that no one in the country north of Trondheim had known what the words meant, and that his widow had ridden to a monastery to have them translated, and the monk had translated them, and the words were, "Non me interficit." It did not kill me. I heard this at the age of 53. I wrote it in the Psalter, in the margin of the 121st Psalm, on the day I heard it. Eyvindr had died carrying the same 3 words I have carried. He had learned them from me at the fire on the 3rd night. He had spoken them at his death. The account is not mine alone. The account is at least two men's, and I am the second. And the first is in the ground north of Trondheim, under a stone that does not name what he saw. The arithmetic is this: 32 Norse warriors and 1 Irish slave sailed west from Orkney on the 9th day after the feast of St. John, in the summer of the year of our Lord, 783. 6 Norse warriors and the same slave rowed east on a heading that was the reverse of the outbound heading 22 days later, and made landfall at Skjalgstadir in Hordaland on the 11th of Solmanuder. Of the 6 Norsemen, 2 died on the crossing home. 4 reached Hordaland. Of the 4, the longest lived was Asbjorn Barefist, who died 21 years after the beach. All 4 are now dead. Of the 1 slave, I remain. I am the last. I am dictating this at Lindisfarne, in the 3rd watch of the night, on the eve of the feast of St. Aidan, in the year of our Lord, 844. I am 88 years old. I do not expect to see the feast. The Psalter will pass, at my death, to a novice of this house whose name I have written on the inside of the back cover. He will not understand the marginalia. He will keep the book. The book will pass, in the course of centuries, to hands I cannot foresee. If it reaches a hand that can read the Latin, that hand will read what I have read, and will know what I have known, and will make of it what he can. I have not written the account to persuade. I have written it to record. I did not defeat the creature. I did not escape the creature. The creature elected not to kill me. That is not a story of triumph. It is not a story of survival. It is a story of the choice of a thing older than my faith, and older than my language, and older than the island it stood on. And I have spent 61 years trying to understand the choice, and I do not understand it. I know only what I wrote in the margin of the 91st Psalm on the first night of the row east, and what I write again now, as the last sentence of the account, in the same Latin, in a hand no steadier than the hand of the man I was at sea, though the 61 years lie between. Non me interfecit, nescio quer. It did not kill me. I do not know why.